everyone! Welcome to the Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Power Gamers Tactics Room. This is your host, Bob Battlestone, and I'm its assistant, Adelina. Today we are having another episode of our Deep Dive series, this time looking at Levitate.
Yeah, so Levitate is a pretty awesome spell that I just put on the prep list for a build that I did recently, the Bow Stinger. And there are various second level control spells. I often go with Web. Last time out I went with Maximilian's Earthen Grasp. But taking it on the Bow Stinger reminded me, Levitate is a really, really good spell relative to the others that I think is a little bit underrated. So, Adelina, do you know what Levitate means?
It's kind of like flying, except it's not going like sideways. Like you just stay up in the air.
Right, it's like flying but just up and down.
Yeah.
So, but still a pretty cool power. What would you use Levitate for if you could do it on yourself or another person? For 10 minutes at a time.
Maybe I do it on like an enemy just to like so that they can't move out of the way and easily dodge any other attack. I don't know.
Okay. Well, in real life, when you go into combat?
Well, real life. I don't know. I don't play Dungeons and Dragons.
That's why I'm asking you what you do in real life. If you could levitate, I mean, it's part of your movement, so you could just like run up buildings.
If I could levitate, I'd meditate. Like I just
What does that mean?
If I could levitate, then I'd meditate instead of just going to the ground.
Okay, I would use it for being invincible in single combat.
I'm so confused with myself.
Because I do sometimes enter combat. If they have a gun, it wouldn't help me too much, but otherwise, man, that'd be pretty sweet. And then just, getting around. I mean, doing parkour in New York City, you could easily get up on the rooftops, and then, I don't know. I think it would be kind of a fun spell. But we're going to take a deep dive into Levitate and see how it applies to your Dungeons & Dragons scenarios, because it's pretty wicked. So let's take a look. So I do a lot of builds on this channel, or at least I have been lately, and I have to admit, it's difficult to fit Levitate into a prep list. It competes with a lot of really good second level spells, like Misty Step, Invisibility, See Invisible, Blur, Mirror Image, Shadow Blade, Dragon's Breath, Hold Person, Darkness, Pyrotechnics, Web, Rope Trick, Tasha's Mind Whip, and Suggestion. So those are all really badass spells, and I think that those are the ones that probably come to most people's minds at first when they are considering second level spells in general, and second level control spells in particular, like Web and Hold Person and Tasha's Mind Whip and Suggestion. But I do think that Levitate is a worthy alternative, even though it doesn't necessarily get as much love. It's a spell that comes with excellent versatility. It has defensive, offensive, and utility applications. And while it's technically available only to wizards, sorcerers, and artificers, you can get it through being an air genasi, being a warlock and taking the invocation ascendant step, being a drow and taking the drow high magic feat, or you can get an item like Boots of Levitation or a spell-wrought tattoo. In terms of its defensive applications, it's pretty amazeballs for casters and ranged attackers like archers, warlocks, and even echo knights, because it basically creates auto-win conditions versus enemies with no or poor ranged attacks. In the same sense, it also creates an ultimate defense against those enemies. They can't really do anything to you, and you can just destroy them with your ranged attacks. And remember, when you're casting it on yourself, your mobility is largely unimpeded, as Levitate is just considered part of your move. Now, one fantastic way of taking advantage of Levitate is to not cast it on yourself, but to cast it on a crate, barrel, cauldron, whatever, while you're inside of it, which will gain you the benefits of both Levitate and total cover. Or you can cast it on an object that is large enough to provide total cover and is easy to maneuver around once you cast Levitate on it. Now you can carry this object around on a cart or a mount or something, or you can possibly create the object on the fly if you have a creation bard or a transmuter wizard in the party. You can also use Levitate to get above persistent AoEs if you're unable to move directly out of it. That's particularly useful when the AoE includes difficult terrain like Sleet Storm. Often it's the case that you wouldn't be able to move out of it, but you can levitate above it. Similarly, you can cast it on an ally to lift them out of a dangerous scenario, like if they're surrounded by enemies or if they're in a persistent AoE. And note that this does not incur opportunity attacks as the target is not using their own move. So it can be really useful for that sort of thing. Now, once you cast it, you can use a surface like the wall or the ceiling or something to move yourself around, but you might also be able to create horizontal movement in other means. A lot of this is up to the DM because it's not specified and it's kind of ambiguous, but it would seem reasonable to think that if you had a rope or a whip or something, you could use it to pull yourself along. Might also work with like gust of wind, even though both are concentration, but there would be ways to work around that. So defensively, even though it just moves you up and down, you can possibly generate horizontal movement as well through various means. And it's got a pretty impressive duration. 10 minutes means that you can aggressively precast it, and it might last for multiple battles. The offensive applications are pretty interesting as well. It can be a devastating save or suck in the right situation. One great thing about it is it will affect any type of creature and no creature has immunity. That's definitely not true of some other spells like Hold Person or Charm Person. So it's nice to know that it's going to be effective in a lot of different scenarios. Although do note there's a 500-pound weight limit, which realistically means only medium or smaller creatures. A large creature is almost certainly going to be more than 500 pounds. But still, tons of medium creatures in the game. And it scales well into the higher tiers. I mean, even creatures like Demon Lords often have no fly or ranged abilities. So even at higher level, if you have this in your back pocket and you are opportunistic, you might be able to get away with using a second level spell as a save or die, essentially, which is pretty awesome to get that kind of impact out of a second level spell, even at high level. Another great thing about Levitate is that there's no end of turn save or end conditions. That is just fantastic for a second level spell. Compare it to spells like Hold Person, Web, Maximilian's Earthen Grasp. These all have end of turn saves or end conditions, and Levitate doesn't. That makes Levitate particularly lethal when cast with Portent or Mind Sliver or Chronal Shift, because once you stick that Levitate and it's effective against them, it's over. It totally takes movement and melee attacks off the table for non-flying creatures. And that's presuming that you have at least 15 feet of ceiling or above. For medium creatures, you would need more ceiling if it's a larger creature. And again, this creates an auto win versus creatures with no or poor ranged attacks. It can be particularly devastating when combined with an ally's persistent AoE, since they can't move. Even low-level AoE spells like Cloud of Daggers or Flaming Spear become incredibly powerful when you can subject a creature to their entire durations. You can also use it to lift creatures out of cover and then pincushion them with arrows or cantrips. You do need sight to cast Levitate, but if they're behind 3/4 cover, you can probably still see them, and then you can lift them right out of it and they don't get the benefits of cover. You can cast it on a dropped item to take it out of the reach of enemies. Perhaps if you used a disarm or a heat metal or one of the various ways to get someone to drop something, a command or whatever, then you can follow it up with a Levitate and take that item out of the equation. You might also be able to drown enemies if the environment is favorable. It requires some DM interpretation of the spell description regarding whether they can swim, and obviously you'd have to get them over the water, so it's not necessarily the easiest thing to pull off, but I'm just saying you could do it if the situation is right. And do note that even if you lift them up and drop them, it won't inflict falling damage because it specifies that the target floats gently to the ground when the spell ends. That includes if you end it with a Dispel Magic or something. And you can only lift creatures up to 60 feet anyway, since that's the range of the spell. So a great offensive spell, but not in terms of inflicting falling damage. Finally, there are some utility applications to the spell. Moving objects up to 500 pounds can be situationally useful. For example, you can use it to load a heavy object onto a tensor's floating disc. You can also use it for recon. With its 10-minute duration, you can levitate straight up 2,000 feet to get a bird's eye view of the surroundings. At the end of it, you just fall gently to the ground, and you're all good. Now do note there's some redundancy here with Find Familiar. Usually your familiar can do that for you. But maybe he's dead, maybe you don't want to expose him to danger. Could be lots of reasons you don't want to use your familiar, so it's possible to use Levitate. You can use it if you are facing climbing obstacles like a cliff or something, or if you fall into a pit trap, the caster can circumvent the obstacle and then tie off a climbing rope for allies. You can sometimes use it to circumvent deadly terrain like lava or spike growth. Obviously, you'd have to figure out a way to move horizontally, but it can at least levitate you above those things. And it can potentially be used to set traps by levitating heavy objects above the target area. Then you lead someone underneath it, and then you drop the object, and it'll crush them, theoretically. Finally, a few combos that you can consider with Levitate. I already mentioned that you can combine it with a persistent AoE to grind enemies to death since they can't move out of it. You can combo it with Rope Trick, so as to enter and exit the portal without a rope, and there's no chance of missing the entrance since neither of you move horizontally. You can use a Flying Pet or Summon to push you around while you're floating, like a Warlock Familiar or your Homunculus. You can combine it with Misty Step or Dimension Door or various other teleportation spells so that you can teleport to elevated locations. And you can cast it on your mount to increase your mount's maneuverability, which I think is a great combo with Phantom Steed. Throw in a Levitate there and there's almost nowhere you can't go on your mount. So those were all the ways that I was able to think of to use Levitate, but I'm sure there are probably lots of other really cool ways, so feel free to let me know in the comments any other ways that you can think of to use Levitate, or stories that you might have about how you've used Levitate to great effect. And please, like and subscribe and check out the Patreon, if you like the channel.
So that's it. Thanks for watching. This was your host, Bob Bafflestone, and I'm his assistant, Adelina. See you next time.